It's 1889. You are one of the hundreds of millions of people who have been colonized by an imperial power. You will no longer attend your school. Instead, you will attend their schools, speak their language, study their history, and adopt their culture. Your parents will work for their companies. Your village will pay taxes to their government, and you are all subject to the laws they create. They have taken control of not just your land and labor, but your way of life. They believe you are inferior and primitive, so part of their mission is to civilize your people. They call it the white man's burden. Today, we'll be looking at how peoples across Africa resisted colonialism and answer three guiding questions. Number one, why did people resist colonization in Africa? Number two, how did people resist colonization during the Mau Mau uprising, and to what extent were they successful? And three, what forms of nonviolent resistance were used to fight colonialism, and to what extent were they effective? We will also answer our big picture question. What options do people have when they lose control of their lives and futures? As you've already learned, European imperial powers colonized Africa for a few different reasons. First, European powers expanded their empires to gain access to land, resources, and labor to benefit European governments and businesses. Second, colonizers believed that the African people had to be civilized. Europeans believed that by eliminating and erasing native languages, histories, and traditions and replacing them with European ones, the people of Africa would be better off. So, why did peoples across Africa resist colonization? Ultimately, colonialism signified an end to sovereignty in Africa. Sovereignty is the ability of a group of people to govern itself. All colonized people were subject to the laws and whims of their colonial rulers. One of the biggest changes was the creation of centralized governments controlled by European empires that limited the voices and power of African people, while maintaining European power and dominance. Additionally, European powers gave themselves the right to use military force and violence to establish dominance and maintain European supremacy. Colonizers also created laws that placed heavy restrictions on how and where people could live and work. Native peoples were forcefully removed from their lands, and different ethnic groups were segregated from one another. The most famous example of this is apartheid, a system of institutionalized racial segregation that existed in South Africa between 1948 and the early 1990s. However, the racism, violence, and separateness of apartheid existed long before it was formally adopted in 1948. Colonizers also forced African peoples to culturally assimilate. Cultural assimilation is when a group of people adopt the culture and values of another group. Colonized peoples were forced to abandon their culture, learn the language of their colonizers, and adopt their religious beliefs. Today, languages like Dutch, German, French, and English are all still spoken across the African continent. Let's pause here and respond to the first guiding question. Why did people resist colonization in Africa? Let's examine a case study, the Mau Mau uprising in what is now Kenya. In the late 19th century, Great Britain had established a relationship with Zanzibar, which later became Kenya. By 1895, Britain had founded the East African Protectorate, which gave Britain control of the region but maintained local leadership. However, when the Sultan of Zanzibar began making deals with Germany, Britain decided it needed to assert its authority by establishing the Colony and Protectorate of Kenya, also called British Kenya. The British set up a new government that gave seats to white settlers but did not include any native representatives until 1944. The British then gave millions of acres of fertile land to white settlers and forced the local people to either leave or work on European-owned plantations where they grew coffee, tea, and tobacco for extremely low wages. As a result, local people faced horrific poverty. The situation was made worse by the Master and Servant Acts, or laws that required complete obedience and loyalty to employers throughout the British Empire. In Kenya, these laws were used to bind native laborers to plantations. Violations were punishable by jail, hard labor, and physical abuse. Finally, the native population was forced to wear kipande, or identity document that included their personal details like fingerprints and employment history at all times. These were used to track their movements and prevent them from fleeing plantations. Tensions ultimately culminated in what is now known as the Mau Mau Uprising. The Mau Mau Uprising was a long, violent, armed resistance in Kenya against the British Empire between 1952 and 1960. It was part of a larger movement towards Kenyan independence and is famous for the scale and brutality of the conflict. The uprising was led by the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, also known as the Mau Mau. The uprising was well organized. The swift, deadly attacks mostly took place at night. They targeted white settlers and government officials, as well as native Kenyans who supported European occupation. They used stolen weapons, as well as machetes and bows and arrows. Back in England, the uprising was used to further the narrative that the native peoples of Africa were savage, violent terrorists ruled by emotion and savagery rather than reason. Initially, Britain did not take the uprising seriously, but that quickly changed. The British used military force to squash the rebellion. They declared a state of emergency and began arresting anyone suspected of participating in or supporting the uprising. The British established concentration camps to rehabilitate members of the uprising. The number of people interned in these camps is unknown, somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000. These camps were sites of forced labor, mutilation, and torture. The total number of native Kenyans killed in the conflict is also unknown, but estimated to be between 11,000 and 100,000. Although the uprising failed to achieve independence, the British government made some limited changes to its policies, including allowing some locals to grow coffee for themselves and giving local representatives a greater voice in the government. Ultimately, Kenya finally gained independence in 1963, only 3 years after the uprising ended. Before we take a look at an example of nonviolent resistance, let's pause and respond to the second guiding question. How did people resist colonization during the Mau Mau uprising, and to what extent were they successful? Nonviolent resistance was successful in the Gold Coast, what is now Ghana. Led by Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana became one of the first countries in Africa to gain independence from Britain. Kwame Nkrumah used Gandhi's philosophy of positive action, a method of resistance that used non-cooperation and civil resistance. Nkrumah and his followers used nonviolent methods like protests, strikes, and boycotts against British goods. A coordinated strike in 1950 resulted in 21 days of nationwide non-cooperation. Transportation ceased. Only those who worked in essential services like electricity and medical care continued with their jobs. The British cracked down on protesters and imprisoned leaders. They tried to create division in the movement and used violence to terrorize civilians. Local newspapers were censored or shut down, but it came down to a test of will. The Ghanaian people's ability to unite against the British demonstrated that working together gave them tremendous power. Ultimately, their resilience outlasted British patience. Over the next few years, Nkrumah's political party continued to gain support and influence in government. In 1952, Nkrumah became Prime Minister of Ghana, which was still under the control of the British Empire. But by 1957, Ghana finally gained independence. There are countless other examples of both violent and nonviolent forms of resistance that were used across the colonies in Africa. Some Africans left their homeland as a form of resistance. This self-imposed exile was sometimes permanent and sometimes temporary. For example, in what is now northern Senegal, an estimated 20,000 Fulani people migrated to escape the inhumane treatment of their French colonizers. Defiance was also communicated through art, music, and poetry. Soul music, which originated in the United States, was associated with anti colonialism. Some called it James Brown Defiance, named after the James Brown song Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, which became a sort of anti colonial slogan. Some artists, writers, and poets were exiled and imprisoned because of their anti colonial efforts. Let's pause here and respond to our third guiding question. What forms of nonviolent resistance were used to fight colonialism, and to what extent were they effective? The cumulative pressures of decades of rebellions, boycotts, and other acts of resistance, coupled with the pressures from civil rights organizations and the international community, all led to decolonization, when a colonizing power withdraws from a former colony. One after another, former colonies declared their independence. However, both private businesses and foreign governments continued to exercise influence over the continent. Countries like China, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, and Qatar have gained control of fertile lands to grow crops like rice in Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, and Mali. Private businesses also operate mines that produce minerals like tantalum, tungsten, and cobalt, which are used in smartphones and other electronic devices. These mines are infamous for their dangerous conditions and use of forced labor and child labor. Today, individuals and organizations are fighting to end child labor and the exploitation of African people and resources. Will these efforts prevail? Only time will tell. For now, acts of resistance and the legacy of colonialism continue because history is everywhere. Hey, hey.